A hung-up limb 30 feet overhead doesn't show up as a hazard to a sensor scanning canopy density, it shows up as a hazard to a trained eye that spent enough years underneath these trees to know the specific, wrong way a broken branch hangs when it's waiting to come down on whoever starts cutting beneath it. I've been falling timber for 20 years, the last 11 as harvest foreman for Holden Forest Products, and the first thing any faller worth trusting learns, usually from someone older who learned it the same hard way, is that you look up before you ever look down at your saw, every single time, no exceptions, because the tree that kills you is rarely the one you're actually cutting. My name is Garrett Holden. My grandfather, Otto, founded this company 61 years ago with 2 chainsaws and a logging truck, and for the last 4 years, even after formally stepping back from daily operations, he's remained chairman and the driving force behind TimberSync, a GPS-guided harvest coordination system he championed personally, installed across every mechanized feller buncher and every ground crew radio in our operation. This is a story about my grandfather, about a system he built because he genuinely believed it would make this company's logging operations safer than anything 2 generations of Holdens managed with instinct alone, and about an October morning when TimberSync's canopy scan cleared a felling zone as safe while a widowmaker directly overhead told a very different story to anyone who bothered to look up. TimberSync came online across Holden Forest Products 4 years ago, a coordination platform built to sequence mechanized feller buncher operations across multiple parallel harvest corridors, using LIDAR canopy scanning and GPS positioning to time directional felling cuts so that machines working adjacent zones never drop timber into each other's active work areas. A genuinely difficult coordination problem that had, before TimberSync, relied entirely on radio calls between operators and a foreman's own running mental map of who was cutting where. My grandfather had pushed hard for the system from its earliest proposal, arguing, correctly, that a crew running 6 mechanized harvesters across adjacent corridors, coordinating entirely by radio, was one missed call away from a felled tree landing where a ground crew member had every reason to think it was clear. TimberSync's LIDAR scans the whole canopy in real time, Garrett, he told me, more than once, standing in the same equipment yard he'd built with his own hands 61 years earlier. It knows exactly where every tree in a corridor is, how dense the canopy overlap is, and it won't clear a felling sequence until the fall paths genuinely open. That's a level of coordination no radio call between 6 different operators ever gave us, not in all my years running a saw myself. I don't doubt the fall path coordination's better than 6 operators guessing at each other's timing, Grandpa. What I'm telling you is that a LIDAR scan measuring canopy density isn't the same thing as a trained eye looking specifically for a hung-up widowmaker, and I've walked underneath more than one branch in my 20 years that any density scan would have read as ordinary canopy overlap, right up until it came down on somebody. I want to be fair to what TimberSync actually got right, because this isn't a story about a system built carelessly, or a grandfather who'd stopped caring about the crews working his family's timber the moment he handed daily operations to my father and eventually to me. TimberSync's fall path coordination had genuinely eliminated the specific kind of cross-corridor felling collision that had cost this company 2 serious injuries in the decade before its rollout, exactly the kind of careful, defensible engineering my grandfather had poured his own retirement years into, and I never once doubted he believed in it completely. Right down to personally reviewing every incident report the system's dashboard generated. What the system didn't have, and what nobody building it had fully understood the danger of, was any way for a canopy density scan to distinguish an ordinary overlapping branch from a broken, hung-up limb resting precariously against a neighboring tree's canopy, a distinction that looked, to LIDAR, like nothing more than slightly elevated density in one small section of the scan, and that looked, to a trained faller's eye, like the single most dangerous thing standing between a clear morning and a very bad one. I need to explain the specific hazard this story turns on, because it's the actual center of everything that happened that October morning, and because it's exactly the kind of visually distinctive but sensor-invisible danger a canopy density scan was never built to individually flag. A widowmaker, in logging terms, is a broken branch or partial trunk section still hanging in a tree's canopy rather than having fallen cleanly to the ground, held up by nothing more than friction against neighboring branches, a piece of dead or damaged wood that can come down without warning the moment vibration from a nearby felling cut, or simply enough time and wind, finally shakes it loose. A widowmaker is one of the oldest, most feared hazards in this trade specifically because it's silent and largely invisible from directly beneath, visible mainly from an angle, against the light, to someone who's trained themselves to scan upward methodically before ever starting a saw. Exactly the specific visual pattern recognition that had been drilled into me by an old faller named Dutch Hollis starting my very first season on this crew. TimberSync's LIDAR scan measured canopy density as a proxy for fall path clearance, treating a hung-up widowmaker as functionally indistinguishable from any other overlapping branch contributing to that same density reading, because from the system's sensor perspective, both were simply mass occupying a particular point in three-dimensional space within the canopy, with no way for the scan to determine whether that mass was securely attached growing wood or a loosely hung, ready-to-fall hazard. I'd raised this exact limitation with my grandfather nearly 10 months before this story's events, after spotting a widowmaker myself during a routine pre-felling walkthrough in a corridor TimberSync's scan had already cleared as fully safe for mechanized operation that morning. The scan cleared that corridor at 94% confidence, Garrett. If there'd been a genuine hazard up there, the density reading should have flagged it as an anomaly against the surrounding canopy pattern. It didn't flag it because a widowmaker doesn't read as an anomaly to a density scan, Grandpa, it reads as ordinary canopy mass, the same as every other overlapping branch around it. I only caught it myself because Dutch taught me to look up and specifically scan for that exact silhouette against the light before I ever touch a saw, a habit that has nothing to do with density and everything to do with pattern recognition a LIDAR sensor was never built to do. I want a mandatory visual sweep by a trained faller before any mechanized felling starts in a corridor, regardless of what TimberSync's scan says is clear. That adds real time to every single corridor's startup sequence across the whole operation, Garrett, and I can't authorize slowing down 6 harvesters worth of daily output based on one widowmaker you happen to personally catch during a walkthrough. The system's confidence scoring is exactly designed to flag genuine anomalies. I need something more than a single catch to justify adding a mandatory manual step back into a process we specifically automated to remove that bottleneck. Dutch Hollis had retired the same year TimberSync's engineering team started their earliest field trials, an irony I don't think either my grandfather or I fully appreciated at the time, and I still thought about him nearly every time I walked a corridor before startup, the particular unhurried way he used to stand at the base of a stand for a full minute or more before ever touching his saw, head tilted back, scanning the canopy in slow, deliberate sweeps that had seemed, to me at 19, like an old man's superstition until the first time I watched him call off an entire morning's work over a hazard none of the rest of us had even noticed. He'd told me once that a widowmaker was the one danger in this trade that punished impatience specifically, because everything else, a bad cut, an unstable lean, a misjudged fall line, gave you some warning as it developed, while a hung-up limb simply waited, sometimes for weeks, for exactly the wrong moment to finally let go. I'd carried that lesson through 11 years as foreman without ever needing to fully explain it to anyone who hadn't stood underneath one himself, and I found myself, more than once across that 10-month argument with my grandfather, wishing Dutch were still around to explain it to a LIDAR sensor on my behalf. The morning this story turns on was the second week of October, 6 mechanized feller bunchers running parallel corridors across a steep timber stand roughly 40 minutes from the mill, TimberSync's dashboard clearing corridor 4 for felling operations at 91% confidence following its automated pre-dawn LIDAR pass, a routine clearance identical, on paper, to hundreds of corridor clearances the system had generated without incident over the previous 4 years. I was doing my own foreman's walkthrough of corridor 4 before signaling the harvester operator to begin, a habit I'd never once skipped across 11 years as foreman regardless of what any dashboard cleared, when I looked up into the canopy roughly 60 feet overhead and felt the specific, cold recognition Dutch Hollis had trained into me 2 decades earlier, a broken limb section, easily heavy enough to kill a man outright, hanging at an angle against a neighboring tree's crown that no ordinary growing branch would ever naturally hold, silhouetted just clearly enough against the gray morning sky for a trained eye to read it instantly for exactly what it was. I radioed the harvester operator immediately, a steady young woman named Priya who'd been running mechanized equipment for us for 3 seasons. Priya, hold your position, do not begin the felling sequence in corridor 4, I've got a widowmaker directly overhead near your planned entry point, 60 feet up, hanging on the northeast side of the big Douglas fir at your corridor's edge. Timber sink cleared this corridor at 91% confidence 20 minutes ago, Garrett. Dashboard still showing green across the whole zone, nothing flagged. I know exactly what the dashboard's showing, Priya. I'm telling you what my own eyes are showing me standing right here underneath it, and I'd rather explain a delayed start to your supervisor than explain to your family why we started cutting under a hazard the scan was never built to catch in the first place. I want to describe what I actually did next, because it fell squarely within my formal authority as harvest foreman and, honestly, within the one rule every faller on this crew has followed since long before TimberSync existed, that a foreman's visual identification of an overhead hazard halts operations immediately, full stop, regardless of any automated clearance sitting on a dashboard somewhere back at the yard office. I called a full stand down on Corridor 4, radioed the other 5 harvester operators to hold their own positions until I'd confirmed the hazard wasn't extending into adjacent corridors, and walked the perimeter myself, keeping well clear of the Widowmaker's likely fall radius while I photographed it from 3 different angles for the incident report I already knew I'd be filing that afternoon. Priya shut her machine down completely rather than simply holding position, a decision within her own operator authority that I respected without needing to ask why, the particular instinct of someone who'd clearly absorbed the same fundamental caution this whole crew had been raised on regardless of how much automation now sat between us and the actual trees. I called our climbing specialist, a wiry, endlessly calm man named Ruben who carried out exactly this kind of manual hazard removal a handful of times each season, and stood well back with the rest of the crew while he rigged a controlled rope and pulley extraction, bringing the Widowmaker down safely to the forest floor roughly 40 minutes after I'd first spotted it, a piece of broken trunk section that, once it landed, weighed easily enough to have killed Priya's harvester operator cab occupant outright if it had come down unpredictably during active cutting beneath it. I stood over the Widowmaker once Ruben had it safely down, close enough now to see clearly what the LIDAR scan from 60 feet below had never had any chance of distinguishing, a section of broken trunk nearly the diameter of my own thigh, its fracture surface pale and fresh enough that Ruben guessed it had likely broken loose sometime in the last several weeks, held aloft purely by the accident of how it had landed against its neighbor's crown. That's not a branch that was ever going to read as an anomaly on a density scan, Garrett, Ruben said, running his gloved hand along the fracture surface. It's sitting right in the middle of normal canopy overlap density for a stand this mature. The only way anybody catches this one is looking up specifically for the silhouette, exactly the way Dutch taught half this crew years before any of us had a dashboard telling us anything. That's the whole problem I've been trying to explain for 10 months, Ruben. The scan's genuinely good at what it measures, it's just never going to measure the one thing that actually mattered this morning. I photographed the Widowmaker's fracture surface and its resting position against the neighboring tree's crown, logged the full incident report myself before the afternoon was out, and called my grandfather directly rather than waiting for the report to reach him through the normal chain. My grandfather drove out to the harvest site himself that same afternoon, 79 years old and still perfectly capable of walking the uneven ground to where the Widowmaker still lay where Ruben had brought it down, and I want to describe the conversation honestly, because it wasn't simple vindication for either of us, even with a lethal fracture section sitting on the forest floor in front of both our eyes. 91% confidence on a corridor with a hazard heavy enough to kill somebody outright, Garrett. That's not a marginal miss. That's the exact gap you've been describing to me for 10 months, sitting right here where I can finally see it myself instead of just hearing about it secondhand. I've been telling you the scan can't see what it was never built to look for, Grandpa. I didn't have anything beyond one walkthrough catch until this morning made the gap impossible to keep deferring. This wasn't the system malfunctioning, it was the system doing exactly what density scanning does, and density scanning was never going to be the same thing as Dutch Hollis teaching a 19-year-old kid to look up before he ever touched a saw. Which is exactly the gap I need to sit with, and I know that now in a way I genuinely didn't let myself believe 10 months ago, when you first raised it in the equipment yard. I wasn't dismissing you because I'd stopped trusting your judgment, Garrett. I built TimberSync because I spent 40 years running a saw myself, watching 6 operators coordinate entirely by radio, and I remember exactly how many close calls came out of nothing more than a missed call or a misjudged timing between 2 machines. I wanted a version of this company that didn't depend so completely on that kind of coordination going right every single time, and I think I let that wanting outrun what a canopy scan could actually promise to catch, right up until this morning. I know that, Grandpa. I'm not angry at you for wanting something steadier than 6 operators coordinating by radio alone. I've seen the old incident reports from before I ever picked up a saw myself. I'm telling you that the one time it mattered, a confident 91% clearance was asking Priya to trust a number that could never have accounted for a widowmaker in the first place, and the only reason we're standing here talking about a stand-down instead of an actual incident report with somebody's name on it is that this crew never stopped teaching new operators to look up regardless of what any dashboard says. He was quiet for a long moment, looking up into the canopy where the widowmaker had hung less than an hour earlier, and I watched him run the same calculation I imagined he'd been running since my radio call reached him, the particular founder's math of how many other mornings, across 4 years and 6 harvesters, might have carried the same invisible sensor blind spot without one foreman's habit of looking up happening to catch it in time. I keep thinking about the version of this morning where Priya started the felling sequence before you finished your walkthrough, he said, finally, still looking up into the gap in the canopy, or the version where you'd stopped mentioning that first widowmaker after I pushed back 10 months ago, because I outranked the argument on paper even if I hadn't touched a saw myself in over a decade. I don't like sitting with how much of this morning came down to you personally deciding a habit like looking up couldn't ever become optional, no matter how good the dashboard telling you otherwise looked. I don't love sitting with that either, Grandpa. A system this good shouldn't need one foreman's stubborn habit as its last line of defense before somebody starts cutting underneath something that could kill her outright. That's not a compliment to me, it's a description of exactly the gap we both need to close. You built something genuinely good across 4 years, and I've never once told this crew otherwise, but genuinely good isn't the same as complete, and I think somewhere in the last 10 months you let yourself believe a confidence score could stand in for Dutch Hollis's whole career, when it was never built to do that in the first place. What my grandfather and I built together over the following weeks, working with TimberSync's engineering team directly, was a mandatory visual sweep protocol added permanently into the corridor startup sequence, requiring a foreman's direct sign-off on top of any automated LIDAR clearance before mechanized felling could begin in any corridor, a change that added roughly 10 minutes to each morning startup and that my grandfather, to his credit, championed just as personally and just as publicly as he'd once championed removing that exact step from the process in the first place. I still walk every corridor myself before I ever signal an operator to start, exactly as I did the morning before TimberSync existed and exactly as I will the morning after whatever eventually replaces it, though Priya, I've noticed, has started doing her own upward scan from the cab before she ever engages the felling head, a habit she picked up, she told me once, specifically from watching how seriously this whole crew treated that October stand-down. My grandfather and I still talk about TimberSync's ongoing refinement most weekends now, standing in the same equipment yard he built 61 years ago, except the conversation carries a specific new weight neither of us fully had before that October morning. He told me once that the hardest part of the whole episode wasn't adding the visual sweep protocol back in at all, it was sitting with how completely 4 clean years had let him believe a density scan's confidence score was a genuinely complete picture of what made a corridor safe, right up until his own grandson's habit of looking up finally made the gap impossible to keep deferring. A hung-up limb 30 feet overhead doesn't show up as a hazard to a sensor measuring density, and what I've learned, watching a system my own grandfather built get this one thing wrong for 10 months before finally getting it right, is that the most dangerous gap in a genuinely well-built system is often the one hiding inside exactly the kind of danger the system was never designed to distinguish from ordinary background noise in the first place. It took a broken limb 60 feet up, a 40-minute stand-down, and a grandfather and grandson who trusted each other enough to argue honestly across an equipment yard 10 months before it mattered, to finally close a gap that 4 otherwise excellent years of engineering had never quite found their way to on their own.